We now turn our attention to the vice of avarice, or more commonly known as greed. Before we proceed, I want to quickly go over, just to remind us, get our bearings a little bit. Remember the nature of the virtues and vices. They're acquired by repeated actions, thoughts, desires, attitudes, things along those lines. What happens is, I engage in a particular activity or thought pattern or emotion, and, I do it again, and 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 soon that becomes natural. It's only when it becomes natural that I actually have the virtue, that I'm actually courageous and not just someone doing courageous things. It's only when it comes natural that I have the vice and not just someone doing vicious things. So we've got to keep this in mind, right, as we proceed. The point of these lectures, the point of these readings is for us to get a clear picture on what's going on in our hearts from time to time, what's going on in our lives, so that we can engage in proper diagnoses and that we might apply the appropriate treatments and remedies to our hearts, to our sinful, our spiritual diseases, and that we might flourish as lovers and worshipers of God and lovers of others. That's the goal. As we enter into this discussion of greed or avarice, there's a great television series. Some of you have probably seen it. Some of you may not have. It's a little mature, right? I don't think there's any nudity or anything like that in the series, but it's quite violent and pretty dark. And the series I'm thinking of is Breaking Bad. And so what we see in Breaking Bad is an unbelievable, really, really accurate portrayal of how someone goes from, just doing one thing real quickly and then doing it again and then doing it again. And then by the end of the series, the person that we find at the end is almost unrecognizable from the person who was at the beginning. Walter White is the main character, and he starts off as this seemingly decent, caring guy who just does this one thing in order to try and help his family, in order to provide for them. And it's bad what he does. It's certainly not good, but he does it just once or twice, and then 3 times, and then 100, and then 1,000. And as he does it, this vice sets in, and he becomes a monster when he started off as just a kind of regular guy. That's what the vices do. They transform us. The vice of avarice or greed is especially fascinating in this regard. And perhaps it's fascinating in this regard because maybe it transforms us in really subtle ways because of our culture. Our culture might be a culture that encourages this vice so much that we just don't see what it's doing to us until maybe it's too late, or until we experience an event or circumstance that reveals just how much it is that we love money and love possessions. So the definition of greed that we're going to work with is this. This again comes from Aquinas. And it's the excessive love of or desire for money or any possession money can buy. So again, just pointing out some things. Remember, each of these vices is really a matter of the heart. So greed is a matter of the heart. It has to do with our desires for money, our desires for possession. And it's an excessive love. So what does this tell us? Well, this tells us also that there is an appropriate love or an appropriate care or desire for money and possessions. So the desire for money and possessions isn't bad in and of itself. It's just when it gets excessive that we enter into really, really, really bad territory. This also suggests the following. For many or most, or maybe all, but perhaps not, but for many of these vices, it's a mistake to think that we can reliably detect the presence of the vice by looking at external behaviors, or especially just looking at a few. So for example, It would be a mistake to think that the person driving down the road in the Benz or in the Beamer or in the Porsche, that person must be greedy, right? Because remember, greed has to do with an excessive love or desire for money and possessions. Maybe that person doesn't have that. I don't know. Now, look, maybe they should be especially careful. Maybe they should ask themselves from time to time, am I struggling with stuff? And maybe some of these things could be little signs or something like that. But the point is, you cannot read off of the stuff people have to their hearts. You'd have to do more probing, more investigating. If this is someone you love, I recommend that you do it. Part of the reason I say this too is that greed can manifest certainly in the rich, but it most certainly can manifest in the poor. I grew up fairly poor. We often did not have enough food, and so I would go and stay with friends. We often didn't have toilet paper or other things like that, and so we would, my mom would have us run into Taco Bell or McDonald's, and I'd jack toilet paper or something, or paper towels or whatever, napkins for the home. My wife grew up more poor than I did, much poorer than I did. In fact, she spent part of her life living in a car. She lived also in various shelters as she grew up. So I grew up fairly poor. My wife grew up much poorer. Sometimes I feel weird saying I grew up poor when my wife is around, right? Because she grew up so much poorer than I did. We go to India all the time, and I definitely never say that I grew up poor when we go to India, because poor in India ain't like the poor here, let me tell you. But nevertheless, right, we didn't have all the things that maybe we needed, and certainly did not have all the things that we wanted. But there was greed in my family. There was greed in my heart. I did most certainly have an excessive love and desire for money and the possessions that money can buy. So this afflicts the rich. Maybe it afflicts them more than it does others. I don't know. I'm not saying it does, and I'm not saying it doesn't. But the point here is that it can afflict everybody. What's the good thing that greed perverts? Let's start off there. Well, I think one way of thinking about this, and there are lots of other ways that we can think about this, but I like seeing it like this. What greed does is it takes our deep desire for stability, for contentment, and for satisfaction of basic needs. It takes our daily bread, our desire for our daily bread, and it tweaks it. It perverts it, distorts it. Think about it like this. I might reason in this way. Here's how greed shows up. Or it might show up. Here's one way it might show up. I might think, okay, man, having money seems to me to be able to solve my need for a kind of, stability in my living situation, stability with my food and my clothing. It might help satisfy my basic needs in that way. Money's going to help. And so the greedy heart starts seeing this. Well, okay, so money can help me with these things that I need. Money can help me with everything I need. The greedy heart says money can help solve X and Y, so money can solve everything. You see the problem? We end up monetizing everything. We end up making money the solution to all of our problems. What's going to ultimately happen here is that we end up confusing the value of things with the value of persons and ultimately God. So you might think of value in terms of like a hierarchy. What's the most valuable thing in all of reality? God. What's next in that hierarchy? I don't know, maybe angels, humans, whatever, right? What's next? Maybe animals. What's next? Maybe plants. What's next? Maybe inanimate objects, whatever, right? Think of your list. What happens? What happens here? Well, what greed does is greed says those material possessions, money, that stuff, that car, that home, that vacation, that jewelry, that clothing, that's actually what you need. That's the stuff that's going to satisfy and make you feel good. So get that stuff. And then I start valuing that stuff more than I value persons, more than I value God even. The real actual hierarchy of valuable things in reality flips upside down. And now I use God in order to get stuff. Now I use people in order to get stuff. Why? Because stuff matters more to me than God, matters more to me than people. Let me give you a sort of an interesting example of this. And this is sort of a movie, rom-com type of trope. What is it that sometimes these movies portray, women especially, and look, I do think this is a kind of sexism here, and I will point it out. What is it that women especially in these movies are portrayed as doing after a breakup when their heart is broken? What do many of them go do? Let's go shopping. I'm going to go shopping to cure my heart. Now, I think men do this, by the way, just as much as women, maybe more so. I don't know. It'd be fascinating to do a sociological study of this. Maybe men are more prone to go to Best Buy. Maybe men are more prone to go spend their money on electronic goods. But we want to solve our heart's troubles, our broken heart, with stuff. Doesn't that sound really crazy to you? Like it's just a deep category error? It's like trying to solve my thirst by going on a run? I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. And yet we do this. It's bizarre. And I think it involves this fallacy that I mentioned before. We recognize that money can indeed help with respect to some of my needs. And then we say it can help maybe with solving all of them. When we think about seeing everything in terms of monetary value, we end up seeing people in terms of monetary value. And this can be very, very dangerous. So let me give you some examples, some cases where maybe this might show up. Now, please keep in mind, I am not saying that every instance on my list involves seeing people as monetarily valuable, only in terms of money. That's not what I'm saying. My point here is that sometimes the items on my list are due to greed, are due to money. That's my point. Not all, some. Let me give you the list. Euthanasia, assisted suicide, abortion, population control. Sometimes those institutions, those practices are due to money, to greed. Think about euthanasia. What is euthanasia? It's mercy killing, right? It literally means good killing. And so what goes on there? Well, maybe sometimes what's motivating people to say that we need to kill this person who is struggling or suffering or whatever, maybe they're really motivated by this. It's going to cost too much money to keep them alive. Now look, in some cases, that's a relevant consideration. I'm not saying it's never relevant. My point is that sometimes it's greed that's motivating it. Same with assisted suicide. Same with abortion. I'm not saying every abortion is due to greed. That's not the point. But some are. Some people get abortions simply because raising the child is going to be too expensive. It's going to get in the way of their career. It's going to get in the way of their vacation. I can give you testimony after testimony after testimony of cases like this. How does that make you feel? Thinking about persons in terms solely of monetary value. This is that flipping of the hierarchy of values that I mentioned. This should disgust us. Whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, it should disgust you. Think about immigration. I don't know how to solve the immigration crisis that affects our country. This is not me saying I know how to solve it. But my point here is this. Sometimes when we think about immigration, could it be that what's motivating our thoughts is greed? That we're thinking about the immigrant, and the first thing that we're worried about is this. they're going to come here and they're going to make life more difficult for us in terms of money, in terms of the economy. Now, look, is that never relevant? No, I'm not saying it's never relevant. That's not the point here. The point here is that when that's where my heart goes first, when that's the first direction my heart goes, that should make me worried. Instead, it seems to me that, look, no matter what the immigration policy should be, no matter what the economics of this, turn out to require, I'm not advocating a policy. My point here is, though, when I first think of the immigrant, do I think in terms of dollar signs or do I think in terms of love? Do I think of the immigrant along these lines? Holy crap, this person has left their entire ancestors, all of their home, all of their family to come here. Why? What is motivating them? How awful it must be for them. How can I help? Maybe the best way to help is to encourage them to go home, is to help them with their home situation and not have them come here. So I'm not advocating a policy. I'm advocating for us to consider the dispositions of our heart. When I think of the immigrant, what do I think of first? Do I think of person who is me and must be loved as though they are me? Or do I think in terms of dollar signs? That's the idea. We can think of greed also in terms of our spending habits. Think about it like this, right? Our spending and giving habits. When I'm giving away my stuff to Goodwill, when I'm thinking about what I've got, am I ever willing to give up some of my nicer stuff? How would I, let me put it like this. I don't know how to test this. I haven't come up with a really good experiment to test this. If you come up with one, please share it with me. I need it. But what we really need to do is figure out ways to test our hearts with respect to our stuff. And so here's a test. We can do it in our heads. I don't know how to do it in reality, but it would be like this. How would you react if your car gets stolen or damaged or wrecked in some way, or if your clothing, or if some of your TV, or some of your, so my point here is not that it wouldn't be disappointing. Of course you'd be disappointed. But would it ruin you? Would it sort of destroy you if you lost all your possessions, if you had to give them away, if God came to you and said, sell all your stuff and come follow me? Would you be able to do it? How would you feel? How difficult would it be? That's a way to sort of test our hearts when it comes to money and possessions. I don't know exactly the best way an experiment to design to really do that. So greed values just the stuff, and it doesn't really value what the stuff can do or what the stuff is really for. So you might think along these lines here, do you want a new table so you can entertain lots of guests? Or do you just want a new table because it's going to make you feel good that you got a new table? Do you want a new TV so that you can entertain others? Or do you just want a new TV because it's a nice way of sort of making you feel good? It satisfies this little longing in your heart. You see the difference? Stuff can be wonderful if it's directed towards enhancing love of neighbor, love of God. Do we have greedy hearts towards education? So I want us to think about education here. What is my attitude towards education? Here's something I'm very, very worried about. I think a lot of schools, and I'm sorry to say, I'm sad to say, I think this is true for a lot of Christian institutions, send the following message. Come here so that you can make lots of money. Come here so that you can get a job. We think of education in terms of money, in terms of stuff. I think in a way that this is almost as diabolical as you could get with respect to education. The education that is emphasizing these institutions, these colleges and universities that are constantly emphasizing job, stuff, money. Come here because we're going to get you that stuff. What they're doing is they're training you to believe and act as though money and possessions are what matters. That's what they're doing. And that will ruin you. That's idolatry. No, education, it seems to me, is for helping us to become free of those desires, those habits that enslave, those desires, those habits that destroy. That's what a truly educated person is after. A truly educated person is after becoming free, liberated from the desires, the appetites, the habits that ruin, that enslave. But the way that we advertise, the way that we talk about, the way that we recruit with respect to higher education, I think conveys the exact opposite message. It's very, very worrisome to me. When we're thinking about greed, when we see greed sort of expanding and we start seeing everything monetarily, what's going on, or what may result, is a fascinating kind of relativism, moral relativism, which will end up resulting in a kind of denial of God. Here's the idea. This is a really fascinating sort of connection. When we make money the measure of value, when everything becomes monetized and is seen in terms of money, we wind up making ourselves the measure of value. How does that work? Well, typically we often think that prices are decided by us in some way. Right? It's decided by the manufacturers, by the sellers, it's decided by the market, the purchasers, and so on and so forth. But we are the principal people involved in establishing the monetary value of something. So if everything is to be seen in terms of monetary value, then we are the principal deciders, determiners of the value of everything. That's the fall. That's the Garden of Eden. That's a rejection of the authority of God and making me and us the authority of the value of everything. Now look, we've got to have practical wisdom here, right? So we need to recognize that, of course, we're called to provide for ourselves. We're called to provide for our families. And so, again, making money, acquiring money, we have to discern what the right amount is in order to acquire, in order to provide well. This is called practical wisdom. We have to have practical wisdom. So, this greed is so tricky because in so many ways, right, it's so easy for us to slip and turn into greedy persons. Turn our love of providing, our love of helping, into a love of the stuff itself. How might greed show up in the garden in other ways that I've mentioned? Well, you might think of it like this. Adam and Eve, what do? Well, they take something that they're not supposed to take. They steal. What's one of the most obvious manifestations or symptoms of greed? Theft, stealing. The greedy heart is going to tend towards theft, towards being willing to steal, willing to lie to get what they want, to get more money, to get more stuff. What do Adam and Eve do? Well, there's something they can't have, and so they go after it. So maybe there's kind of a form of stealing. I'm sort of thinking of this maybe as metaphor, maybe as analogy, but I think we can see some of the seeds there. What are some of the symptoms? Well, some symptoms of greed are like this. A willingness to deceive, right? I might be willing to deceive in order to keep more money, in order to keep more possessions. Maybe I'm going to lie on my taxes. Maybe I'll lie to my parents. Maybe I'll lie to my friends about how much money I've got. Maybe I'll lie to my spouse in order to keep a little more from me. One of the fascinating symptoms or offspring vices, fruits of greed, is this one, a callousness towards those in need. Now, I think the fascinating part of this is what happens with greed is that we stop even noticing the persons who have deep needs, monetary, possessional, material needs. And so what we end up doing is this. We end up coming up with excuses. We say, they're poor because they're lazy. They're poor because they're probably an addict. So we end up coming up with rationales. And we know our heart doesn't break for them, for those who are poor. Now look, in some cases, maybe there is poverty because they're lazy. Maybe there is poverty because of drug addiction. That's not the point. The point here is the greedy heart actually looks for that first. That's the point. Alienation. How might we be alienated from God, alienated from others, alienated from ourselves? Well, it's obvious, right? I've already talked about this. As greed comes in, it flips our values and we start valuing stuff, valuing money more than God, more than others, even more than ourselves. And so we become alienated. I think one of the coolest ways to remedy greed, I really do think this is an awesome way. It's the one mentioned in the book, tithing. When you tithe 10% of your income, you are saying, God, I trust you. I trust you with my money. I trust you with my possessions. And I'm going to give it away. I'm going to give it away because I value the kingdom of God more than I value the kingdom of David. I want the kingdom of God to flourish, so I'm going to give money to help that happen, to the spreading of your gospel, the good news. And I'm not going to keep it all for myself to expand the kingdom of David. That's an awesome remedy. I encourage you to try it, and here's one reason why. Less than 1% of people under 25 years old tithe 10% of their income. And that's less than 1% of church-going people under 25. Give it a shot. See what it does to your heart.